Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The painting was discovered in the spring of 1902, though some accounts suggest it had been circulating through the remote cabins and settlements of the Ozark Mountains for decades prior. What made this particular oil painting so remarkable wasn't its artistic merit, though witnesses described it as possessing an unusual technical proficiency, but rather the profound psychological effect it seemed to have on those who owned it. Between 1902 and 1963, when the painting reportedly disappeared from a private collection in Springfield, Missouri, no fewer than 7 individuals who possessed the artwork for extended periods experienced severe mental deterioration. 3 were institutionalized. 4 died under circumstances that official records describe as self-inflicted. The Hendrickson family of Taney County would be the first documented owners, though certainly not the last. Their homestead stood just east of what is now Branson, Missouri, nestled in a narrow valley where morning fog would linger until midday. The property consisted of a modest 2-story farmhouse, a tobacco barn, and several outbuildings in varying states of disrepair. Local tax records indicate that Samuel Hendrickson, a furniture maker by trade, purchased the 80-acre property in 1897, moving his wife Margaret and brother Thomas from their previous residence in Springfield. Neighbors described the Hendricksons as private but cordial. Samuel's furniture business provided modest but steady income, with several pieces still displayed in historical collections throughout the region. The family kept to themselves but participated in community gatherings when invited. Nothing in public records suggests anything unusual about their lives until April 1902. According to an account published in the White River Leader, the local newspaper serving Taney County at that time, Samuel Hendrickson returned from a 4-day trip to Springfield with a large wrapped package. He had gone to deliver several commissioned furniture pieces and returned with what he described to neighbors as an artistic curiosity he had acquired in trade. The painting, approximately 30 by 40 inches and housed in a hand-carved oak frame, depicted a scene that would later be described differently by various observers. This inconsistency in description would itself become part of the painting's disturbing legacy. What is known with certainty is that the subject matter involved a rural homestead, not unlike those common in the Ozarks at the time. Most accounts mention a cabin or farmhouse, a stand of oak trees, and a single human figure, though descriptions of this figure vary significantly across testimonies. Some described an older man standing at a distance from the house, while others insisted it depicted a woman seated in a rocking chair on a porch. One detailed account, provided by Reverend James Whitley of the Hollister Methodist Church, described no figure at all, but rather an empty chair with unusual shadows that merely suggested human presence. The original artist remains unknown. Samuel Hendrickson claimed to have acquired the painting from a traveling merchant named Jeremiah Blackwood, who operated a small trading post near the James River. When investigators later attempted to locate this merchant for questioning following the incidents at the Hendrickson farm, no trace of anyone by that name could be found. Records from the county clerk's office show no business license issued to a Jeremiah Blackwood, nor does that name appear in any census data for the region dating back to 1870. The newer technique employed in the painting's creation has been described by the few art experts who examined it as technically accomplished but stylistically unusual. Professor William Barrett from the Missouri Art Institute, who briefly viewed the painting in 1927, wrote that it displayed a precision of detail reminiscent of the Hudson River School, yet with certain peculiarities of perspective that create a subtle sense of wrongness. The shadows in particular seem to fall at impossible angles, suggesting multiple light sources that do not appear in the scene itself. The Hendricksons displayed the painting in their parlor, where it remained for approximately 6 weeks. During this period, neighbors and acquaintances who visited the home reported nothing unusual about the family's behavior. Margaret Hendrickson reportedly told a neighbor that she found the painting unsettling but appreciated its craftsmanship. Thomas Hendrickson, Samuel's brother, who occupied a room on the second floor of the house, was not recorded as having any particular reaction to the artwork. A journal kept by Margaret Hendrickson, discovered decades later during renovations to the property, reveals subtle changes in the household atmosphere following the painting's arrival. In an entry dated April 30, 1902, she writes, "Samuel spends much of his evening seated before the painting. He claims to find it restful, though I cannot share the sentiment. There is something in the scene that troubles my sleep when I have looked upon it too long." By mid-May, her entries begin to reference unusual occurrences in the home. "The house has grown colder since the painting arrived," she writes on May 12th. "Even with the spring warming, the parlor remains chilled." Thomas complains of hearing footsteps in the night, though when he investigates, he finds nothing. Samuel dismisses our concerns and grows irritated when I suggest moving the painting to another room. The first documented incident occurred on June 7, 1902, according to statements provided to the county sheriff and preserved in courthouse records. Margaret Hendrickson awoke before dawn to find her husband standing before the painting, apparently engaged in conversation with it. When she approached him, he reportedly did not acknowledge her presence for several minutes, continuing to speak in hushed tones to what he referred to as the figure in the shadows. When finally responding to his wife's increasingly distressed inquiries, Samuel allegedly stated that he needed to make certain adjustments to the frame, as it was allowing too much to seep through. Margaret's journal entry from that morning offers additional context. "I found him before dawn, speaking to the painting as one might address an old friend. When I finally gained his attention, his eyes seemed unfocused, as though waking from deep sleep. He spoke of the frame needing repair, though I can see no damage to it. When I suggested removing the painting until he had rested, he grew agitated in a manner I have never witnessed in our 15 years of marriage." Over the following 2 weeks, Samuel's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He abandoned his furniture work entirely, spending hours seated before the painting. According to Thomas Hendrickson's later statement to authorities, his brother began to sleep in the parlor, refusing to leave the painting unattended at night. He spoke less frequently, and when he did, often made reference to watchful eyes and patient waiting. Margaret reported that he stopped eating regular meals, subsisting on cold coffee and occasional bread. On June 15th, Margaret's journal records finding Samuel measuring the painting with unusual precision. He is taken to measuring the canvas and frame multiple times daily, recording the dimensions in a small notebook he keeps in his breast pocket. When I inquired as to the purpose, he told me the dimensions were gradually changing and that he needed to track the expansion. The frame appears no different to my eye. By June 20th, her entries grow increasingly desperate. Samuel spent the entire night speaking to the painting. His voice never rose above a whisper, but the conversation was continuous. When morning came, I found him still standing before it, unaware that hours had passed. His eyes were bloodshot, his complexion gray. When I insisted he rest, he told me he could not, as the exchange requires constant attention. I do not know what he means by this. On June 23, 1902, Margaret Hendrickson left the property to stay with her sister in nearby Hollister after what she described as a particularly troubling incident in which she found Samuel apparently attempting to step into the painting, his hands pressed firmly against the canvas while muttering about the doorway being almost open. Thomas remained at the property, later claiming he felt obligated to keep an eye on my brother, who was clearly unwell. Thomas Hendrickson's subsequent statement to authorities reveals that Samuel's condition deteriorated rapidly after Margaret's departure. He stopped acknowledging my presence entirely, Thomas testified. He would stand before the painting for hours, occasionally reaching out to touch the canvas with his fingertips. I observed that he had begun to modify the frame, carving small symbols into the wood at regular intervals. When I examined these markings closely, they appeared to be a series of eyes. What happened in the early morning hours of June 26, 1902, has been pieced together from Thomas Hendrickson's testimony to the county sheriff, physical evidence collected at the scene, and the subsequent coroner's report. According to these sources, Thomas was awakened shortly after midnight by sounds of movement in the parlor. Upon investigating, he found Samuel standing before the painting, which had been moved from its usual position to the center of the room. Samuel had apparently arranged all the furniture in the parlor to face the artwork. When questioned by his brother, Samuel allegedly turned and stated calmly that they're ready to make the exchange now. Thomas, concerned by his brother's pallor and distant manner, attempted to lead him back to bed. In the ensuing struggle, Samuel broke free and, according to Thomas's statement, threw himself at the painting with such force that both he and the frame crashed through the parlor window. Thomas's testimony continues. I rushed to the window and looked down, expecting to see my brother on the ground below. Instead, I saw only the frame and shattered glass. Samuel was nowhere to be seen. It was as though he had vanished into the night. I searched the property until dawn with a lantern, calling his name, but found no trace. Samuel's body was discovered the following morning by a neighbor, Edwin Mills, who had come to deliver a package. It was found approximately 30 yards from the house, beneath a stand of oak trees that bore a striking resemblance to those depicted in the painting. The coroner's report lists the official cause of death as exsanguination due to severed arteries, though it notes with clinical detachment that the deceased's facial expression displayed unusual serenity incongruous with violent death. The painting, remarkably, sustained only minor damage to its frame and a small tear in the upper right corner of the canvas. A detail omitted from official records but preserved in local oral history claims that the position in which Samuel's body was found, seated with his back against an oak tree, face turned toward his home, exactly mirrored the position of the figure in the painting as it appeared after his death. Whether this alignment was coincidental or deliberately arranged remains unknown. Following Samuel Hendrickson's death, the painting was removed from the property by Margaret, who reportedly told neighbors she could not bear to look at it. According to local records, she sold it to Augustus Wheeler, a prominent businessman from Forsyth, the county seat, for an undisclosed sum. Wheeler, a collector of regional art and artifacts, reportedly purchased the painting out of what associates described as historical interest after hearing rumors of its connection to the Hendrickson tragedy. Wheeler would own the painting for approximately 9 months. During this period, he displayed it in his study, a room located in the eastern wing of his substantial Victorian home overlooking the White River. Wheeler kept extensive journals, several volumes of which were donated to the Taney County Historical Society following his death. These writings provide the most detailed first-hand account of the painting's appearance and effect. In his entry dated August 12, 1902, Wheeler describes the painting as competently executed in the realist tradition, though with certain peculiarities of perspective that create a subtle but persistent sense of unease. He notes that the homestead depicted bears resemblance to several properties in the Buffalo Creek area, but that no exact match exists to my knowledge. Most significantly, Wheeler writes that the human figure, initially appearing to be that of a man standing at the tree line, seems to have shifted position slightly since my acquisition. I have examined the canvas carefully and find no evidence of tampering or that it is anything other than a conventional oil painting. Yet the impression of movement persists. Wheeler, unlike the Hendricksons, approached the painting with scholarly detachment. His early entries show a methodical investigation of its provenance and artistic technique. He contacted several regional artists to determine if they recognized the style or technique, but none could identify the creator. He even attempted to locate the specific property depicted, making several excursions to areas that resembled the landscape in the painting, but found no exact match. By September, however, Wheeler's entries begin to shift in tone. He writes on September 28th, I find myself increasingly drawn to study the painting at odd hours. Twice this week, I have awakened in the middle of the night with an inexplicable urge to verify its condition. The figure, which I initially perceived as a man at the edge of the forest, now appears to have advanced several paces toward the house. I have taken photographs to compare, but the results are inconclusive due to limitations of the equipment. On October 15th, he records, "I have begun to dream of the location depicted in the painting. In these dreams, I approach the house from the forest edge, always advancing, but never quite reaching the structure. There is a sense of anticipation in these dreams, as though something significant awaits within. I find myself disappointed upon waking." Subsequent entries document Wheeler's growing preoccupation with the painting. By late October, he reports having moved a cot into his study to continue observations through the night. He describes waking repeatedly to check whether the figures has moved during my sleep. He began to cancel social engagements and business meetings, citing a need to continue my research uninterrupted. By December, Wheeler's handwriting shows marked deterioration, and his entries become increasingly fragmented, focusing almost exclusively on the painting. He writes of hearing whispers from the direction of the canvas, when the house is otherwise silent, and of feeling a distinct cooling of the air when seated before it for extended periods. His entry for December 24th reads, "The figure now stands at the edge of the porch steps. I am certain of this. I have measured the distance with calipers and recorded it precisely. There can be no doubt of movement. What is more, I am now certain that the figure is looking directly outward toward the viewer, toward me. There is recognition in that gaze." Throughout January and February 1903, Wheeler's journal documents his declining health and increasing isolation. Household staff reported that he rarely left his study, taking meals there and often refusing to admit even close associates. He wrote of feeling a thinning of the barrier between himself and the painting, and of brief moments when the canvas seems more like a window than a painted surface. His final complete entry, dated March 3, 1903, reads, "It is not a painting of a place. It is a window to it. The figure watches me as I watch it, patient, waiting for recognition. I understand now what Hendrickson discovered. The frame is the only barrier, and it is weakening." On March 7, 1903, Wheeler's housekeeper discovered him in his study, unresponsive and in a state of severe catatonia. Medical records from the Springfield Asylum, where he was subsequently committed, describe his condition as profound withdrawal with selective mutism. The attending physician noted that Wheeler would only speak to ask if the frame was still intact, and to insist that someone must always be watching it, or it will complete its emergence. Dr. Horace Blackwood, the physician who treated Wheeler at the asylum, kept detailed notes on his condition. "The patient exhibits an unusual form of monomania," he wrote in April 1903. "His entire consciousness appears fixed on a painting that was removed from his home. When the artwork is mentioned, he becomes agitated, insisting that it is not complete and that the exchange was interrupted. When asked to elaborate, he becomes withdrawn again, sometimes for days." Attempts to treat Wheeler's condition proved unsuccessful. Various therapies common to the period, including hydrotherapy, electrical stimulation, and sedation, produced no improvement. His physical health gradually declined, a circumstance Dr. Blackwood attributed to the patient's complete disinterest in self-preservation. By late 1906, Wheeler was described as emaciated and frequently non-responsive. Wheeler remained institutionalized until his death from pneumonia in 1907. The painting, according to asylum records, was claimed by his nephew, Edward Wheeler, who reportedly intended to sell it to cover his uncle's outstanding medical expenses. Edward Wheeler's correspondence, preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives, reveals his initial skepticism regarding the painting's reputed effects. In a letter to his wife dated April 22, 1907, he writes, "I have retrieved Uncle's infamous painting. It is a rather unremarkable landscape, though skillfully executed. I cannot fathom how such a benign object could have contributed to his decline. I have placed it in the guest room for now until a buyer can be found." A subsequent letter dated May 18th suggests a rapid change in attitude. "I have moved the painting to my study. There is something in its execution that rewards close observation. The perspective shifts subtly depending on viewing angle and lighting conditions. Most curious is the figure near the tree line. Sometimes it seems to be looking directly at the observer, while from other angles it appears to be facing the house. A clever artistic trick, no doubt. By June, Edward's letters mention difficulty sleeping and unusual dreams of the location depicted in the painting. His final preserved correspondence, dated July 3, 1907, informs his wife, who was visiting relatives in St. Louis, that he had made arrangements to sell the painting to a collector from Kansas City and that she should return at her earliest convenience. "As I find myself increasingly uneasy alone in the house with it, the painting's trail grows more difficult to follow." In the years between 1907 and 1915, fragmentary records and second-hand accounts suggest it changed hands several times, often following patterns similar to the Hendrickson and Wheeler cases, initial fascination giving way to obsession, followed by psychological deterioration of the owner. One account from the Springfield Republican, dated 1909, makes passing reference to the notorious Ozark painting that has left 2 more victims in its wake, though no names are provided. A report filed with the Joplin Police Department in 1912 documents the disappearance of one Walter Grange, a local shop owner. The report, filed by Grange's business partner, notes that the missing man had recently acquired an oil painting of considerable size depicting an Ozark homestead, and had grown increasingly preoccupied with the artwork, claiming to observe changes in its appearance. Grange was never located, though his home was found in immaculate condition, with no sign of struggle or planned departure. The painting was not found on the premises. The next thoroughly documented owner was Dr. Elias Crawford, a psychology professor at a small college in Springfield, who acquired the painting in approximately 1915. Unlike previous owners, Crawford approached the painting as an object of scientific study, having heard rumors of its psychological effects. His acquisition of the piece was deliberate and experimental, an attempt to either debunk what he considered superstitious folklore or to document an unusual psychological phenomenon. Crawford kept meticulous records of his observations, which were later published in an obscure academic journal in 1919. His initial approach was methodical. He installed the painting in a specially prepared room in his home, positioning it so that it would be visible from his desk but not dominate his field of vision. He established a routine of viewing the painting for precisely 30 minutes each day, documenting his psychological state before and after each viewing session. For the first month, Crawford reported no unusual effects. He described the painting in clinical terms, noting the competent but unremarkable brushwork and conventional composition. He specifically noted that, contrary to previous accounts, he observed no changes in the position or appearance of the figure, which he described as an older man in dark clothing standing at the edge of a wooded area, facing away from the viewer. Crawford's early notes show a determination to approach the painting with scientific detachment. He writes, "If this object does indeed produce the psychological effects attributed to it, the mechanism must be identifiable through careful observation. I hypothesize that certain visual elements, perhaps the perspective or color, relationships, trigger specific neurological responses in susceptible individuals." He conducted various experiments to test his hypothesis, including viewing the painting under different lighting conditions, from various distances and angles, and while in different psychological states. He even invited several colleagues to view the artwork and record their impressions, though none reported unusual experiences during these brief exposures. By the second month, however, subtle changes begin to appear in Crawford's notes. He reports momentary peripheral impressions of movement when looking away from the painting, though he attributes these to expected psychological effects of prolonged focus on a static image. He increases his viewing sessions to 1 hour, twice daily. On October 12, 1915, Crawford writes, "I have begun to notice a curious phenomenon when viewing the painting in the late afternoon. As the natural light fades, the shadows depicted in the scene appear to deepen disproportionately. The effect is subtle but consistent. Most notable is the shadow cast by the figure, which sometimes seems to stretch toward the viewer's position, beyond the logical boundaries of the painted scene." In his third month of study, Crawford's notes reflect growing uncertainty about the figure depicted. He writes, "Upon close and extended observation, I find it increasingly difficult to discern whether the figure is, as I initially believed, facing away from the viewer, or if it is in fact turned slightly toward the observer. The posture suggests the former, while the suggestion of facial features, previously unnoticed, implies the latter." By December, Crawford had abandoned his initial experimental protocols in favor of prolonged immersive observation. His notes from this period become more subjective, with increasing references to his emotional and psychological responses to the painting. He describes experiencing a profound sense of recognition when viewing the artwork, as though the scene depicted holds some personal significance that remains just beyond conscious recall. Crawford's wife, Helen, became concerned as his research intensified. In a letter to her sister dated April 23, 1916, she writes that Elias had become wholly absorbed in his study, extending his viewing sessions to most of his waking hours. She reports that he had taken to covering all mirrors in their home and had developed an aversion to his own reflection that she found most troubling. "He speaks of the painting as though it were a puzzle to be solved," Helen wrote, "but I fear it is consuming him. Last night I found him standing before it at 3 in the morning, whispering to himself. When I asked what he was doing, he told me he was listening for the response. He grows thin and pale, and his academic colleagues have begun to inquire after his extended absence from campus." By June 1916, Crawford had abandoned his formal observation schedule entirely. His notes, once methodical and objective, become increasingly abstract and philosophical, filled with ruminations on the permeable nature of observation and the reciprocal gaze. He refers repeatedly to the exchange and the offering, concepts he never clearly defines, but which appear to hold profound significance in his deteriorating worldview. A fragment from his notes, dated June 28, reads, "The painting does not depict a place, it contains it. The canvas is not a barrier but a threshold. The figure is not painted, but imprisoned, waiting for recognition and release. I understand now what happens to those who study it too closely. We do not go mad. We simply begin to perceive what has always been there, hidden behind the veil of conventional perception." Helen Crawford's final letter regarding her husband's condition, dated August 8, 1916, describes finding him standing before the painting at 3 in the morning, his nose nearly touching the canvas, whispering as though in conversation. When questioned, he reportedly told her that he was negotiating terms and that an agreement had nearly been reached. On August 10, 1916, Helen returned from visiting her sister to find their home empty. The painting remained in its place, but Elias Crawford had vanished. A search of the surrounding area yielded no results. His disappearance remains officially unsolved, though local rumors persisted for decades that he had been seen wandering the remote hills of the Buffalo River region, apparently disoriented and speaking of having crossed over but finding himself unable to remain. An unusual detail noted in the police report but omitted from newspaper accounts concerns a small camera found set up on a tripod facing the painting. The last photograph taken, developed from the film in the camera, showed the painting as described in earlier accounts, with one significant difference. The figure, previously described as standing at the edge of the forest or on the porch steps, was now depicted as standing directly before the canvas, facing outward as though about to step through a doorway. The painting was subsequently sold by Helen Crawford to cover debts, passing to a private collector in Kansas City whose identity is not clearly established in available records. For approximately a decade, the painting's whereabouts and effects go largely undocumented, though scattered newspaper accounts from communities throughout Missouri and northern Arkansas occasionally reference a cursed Ozark painting associated with madness and disappearances. A brief article in the Arkansas Gazette from 1923 mentions an unnamed traveling exhibit of curiosities that included the infamous painting said to have driven men to madness in the Ozark Hill country. The article notes that the exhibit was closed by local authorities following disturbing incidents involving attendees, though no specifics are provided. The next verifiable owner was Jonathan Mercer, a wealthy timber merchant from Black Rock, Arkansas, who acquired the painting at an estate auction in 1927. Mercer, described by contemporaries as practical to the point of severity and having no patience for superstition, reportedly purchased the painting specifically because of its notorious reputation, which he dismissed as backward hill country nonsense. Mercer displayed the painting prominently in the front parlor of his substantial home, deliberately making it visible to visitors as a way of demonstrating his rationality and disdain for local superstitions. According to accounts from his household staff, he would often recount the painting's history to guests with obvious amusement, inviting them to observe how completely unaffected he remained despite prolonged exposure to the supposedly cursed object. Beatrice Harmon, who served as Mercer's housekeeper for over a decade, later recalled, "Mr. Mercer took special pleasure in showing that painting to visitors. He'd tell all those terrible stories about what happened to the previous owners, then laugh and say, 'Yet here I stand, sound of mind and body after looking at it every day.'" He considered himself above such foolishness. For nearly 5 years, Mercer's confidence appeared justified. Unlike previous owners, he displayed no unusual behaviors or obsessions regarding the painting. His business thrived, his health remained robust, and his social standing in the community was undiminished. Local rumors about the painting gradually subsided, and its notoriety began to fade from public consciousness. This period of normalcy ended abruptly in the winter of 1932. According to statements given by Mercer's housekeeper to the local sheriff, preserved in county records, the change began following a severe ice storm that left the Mercer property isolated for nearly 2 weeks. During this period of enforced seclusion, Mercer reportedly spent increasing amounts of time in the parlor, seated before the painting. When the roads were finally cleared and staff returned to the house, they found the furniture in the parlor rearranged, with all pieces facing the painting. Beatrice Harmon's statement describes finding Mercer greatly altered in both appearance and manner. She testified his complexion had grown pallid and he had lost considerable weight. Most troubling was the change in his eyes. They had a distant, almost glazed quality, as though he were looking at something far beyond the room. When I inquired after his health, he responded as though awakening from deep sleep, then assured me he was more well than ever before. Mercer's appearance and demeanor had changed markedly. He had lost considerable weight, his previously well-groomed appearance had grown unkempt, and he spoke little, offering only terse responses when directly addressed. Most troubling to his staff was his new habit of conversing with the painting, an activity he would engage in for hours, speaking in hushed tones that could not be easily overheard. Robert Finley, Mercer's longtime business associate, documented his concerns in a letter to Mercer's physician in February 1933. "I found Jonathan greatly changed from the man I have known these 20 years. He received me in his parlor, seated before that painting he acquired some years ago. Throughout our conversation, which pertained to urgent business matters, his attention repeatedly drifted to the artwork. At one point, he halted mid-sentence, staring at the canvas for nearly a minute before resuming as though nothing had occurred. When I made bold to inquire about his fascination with the piece, he informed me that he was waiting for the figure to complete its journey. I left with our business unresolved and grave concerns for his mental state." By spring 1933, Mercer had withdrawn almost entirely from public life. He neglected his business affairs, refused most visitors, and rarely left the parlor. His cook reported that he would only eat if meals were served to him while he sat facing the painting, and even then, he often left food untouched. A physician summoned by concerned employees diagnosed nervous exhaustion and recommended rest and a change of scenery, advice Mercer vehemently rejected. Dr. James Harrington, the physician who examined Mercer, later wrote to a colleague, "I have encountered many cases of nervous collapse in my practice, but none quite like Mercer's. His physical decline is pronounced, significant weight loss, pallor, muscular weakness, yet he insists he feels stronger and more vital than ever." Most concerning is his fixation on a painting in his parlor. When I suggested removing it temporarily as part of his treatment, he became uncharacteristically agitated, insisting that he needed to maintain visual contact with it. His pupils were notably dilated throughout our conversation, and his pulse was slow but steady, even during moments of apparent distress. In June 1933, Mercer dismissed his entire household staff without explanation, sending written notice and final payment to each employee. The last person to see him alive was his former groundskeeper, who delivered supplies to the house in early July at Mercer's written request. The groundskeeper reported that Mercer appeared severely emaciated and spoke in a distant, dreamy manner, but insisted he was closer than ever to understanding the exchange. The painting, notably, had been moved to the center of the parlor and positioned so that it was the first thing visible upon entering the house. The groundskeeper, Albert Morris, later testified, "Mr. Mercer didn't look right. His clothes hung off him like he was a scarecrow, and his eyes had sunk deep in his face. But the strangest thing was how calm he seemed, almost happy. He kept looking back at that painting while we talked, like he was checking on it. Before I left, he told me, 'It won't be long now.' The figure is almost at the threshold." I didn't know what he meant, but it chilled me something awful. When no further communication came from the property for several weeks, local authorities conducted a welfare check on August 2nd, 1933. They found the house meticulously clean, but entirely empty of food. Mercer was discovered in the parlor, deceased for approximately 10 days, according to the subsequent medical examination. The official cause of death was recorded as inanition, essentially starvation. His body was found seated directly before the painting, his arms outstretched toward it. Sheriff's Deputy William Carver, who discovered the body, provided a detailed account in his official report. The deceased was found in a seated position approximately 3 feet from the painting, which had been placed on a wooden easel in the center of the room. All furniture had been removed from the parlor, except for the chair in which the body was found. The deceased's arms were extended toward the painting, the fingers curled as though grasping something. Most unusual was the expression on the deceased's face. Despite the advanced state of decomposition, the features conveyed an impression of profound serenity or ecstasy. The coroner's report notes 2 unusual details. Despite the advanced state of decomposition, Mercer's facial expression appeared to be one of profound relief or satisfaction, and his fingers were stained with oil paint, matching the colors used in the artwork before him. Close examination of the painting revealed subtle alterations to the background, additional shadows among the trees that had not been present in earlier descriptions. Most significantly, according to the sheriff's report, the human figure in the painting now appeared to be seated on the porch rather than standing by the trees, though this detail was disputed by other witnesses. Dr. Edwin Marshall, the county coroner who examined Mercer's body, wrote in his private journal, "In my 30 years of practice, I have never observed a corpse with such an expression. Despite the grim circumstances of his death, alone, emaciated, surrounded by evidence of self-neglect, his features conveyed neither suffering nor fear, but rather a transcendent joy. Most peculiar were the paint stains on his fingers, which matched precisely the pigments used in the artwork before him. Whether he attempted to modify the painting or simply touched its surface is impossible to determine." Following Mercer's death, the painting was claimed by his only living relative, a cousin from St. Louis, who promptly sold it to a private collector. For the next 3 decades, the painting circulated through various collections, never remaining with a single owner for more than a few years. Reports of its psychological effects continued, though none as dramatic or well-documented as the earlier cases. In 1939, the painting briefly came into the possession of Morris Holloway, a wealthy St. Louis businessman with an interest in the paranormal. Holloway's private journals, published posthumously in 1952, document his experiments with the artwork. He describes photographing the painting daily for 3 months, comparing the images for evidence of change. While most comparisons revealed no discernible differences, Holloway claimed that photographs taken during the full moon showed subtle alterations in the position of the human figure. The figure appears to advance incrementally during the lunar cycle, Holloway wrote, moving from the forest edge toward the house with each passing night of the full moon. The movement is subtle, mere millimeters in the painted scene, but undeniable when the photographs are compared in sequence. Most remarkable is that the figure's advance seems to reset with each new lunar cycle, beginning again at the forest edge. Holloway's interest in the painting ended abruptly when his wife reportedly found him in a state of catalepsy before the artwork, unresponsive yet with eyes open and fixed upon the canvas. Upon reviving, Holloway immediately arranged for the painting's sale, writing that he had glimpsed something behind the figure that no human was meant to perceive. In 1947, the painting briefly came to academic attention when Dr. Harrison Wells, a psychiatrist from Washington University in St. Louis, attempted to conduct a controlled study of its effects. Wells had 10 volunteers view the painting for 30 minutes daily over a period of 2 weeks, recording their impressions and psychological responses. His preliminary findings, published in a regional medical journal, indicated that 7 of the 10 subjects reported unusual perceptual experiences, including the impression that the figure in the painting had changed position or was watching them. Specifically, 3 subjects withdrew from the study before its conclusion, citing excessive unease and intrusive thoughts about the painting when not in its presence. Weld's research notes, more detailed than his published findings, document specific reactions from participants. Subject 4, a 32-year-old male with no history of psychological disorders, reported after his 6th viewing session, "The figure in the painting seems to be looking directly at me, regardless of the angle from which I view it. There is something familiar about its posture, as though it's mimicking the way I stand when observing it. Yesterday I dreamed I was in the landscape depicted, standing at the edge of those trees, looking toward a house that wasn't visible in the painting. I felt I was being watched from behind." Subject 7, a 45-year-old female professor of art history, withdrew after 4 sessions, stating, "There is something fundamentally wrong with the perspective in this work. The shadows fall at impossible angles, suggesting multiple light sources that contradict each other. Most disturbing is my growing certainty that the figure has shifted position between sessions. I find myself thinking about the painting during my waking hours, feeling an irrational urge to return to it. I cannot continue this experiment." Wells himself apparently became increasingly fascinated by the painting during the course of his research. Colleagues noted his growing preoccupation with the mechanism of effect, as he termed it. He theorized that the painting somehow exploited existing psychological vulnerabilities through subtle visual cues that bypassed conscious perception. His proposed follow-up study, which would have involved more extensive exposure to the painting, was rejected by the University Ethics Committee. Shortly thereafter, Wells purchased the painting from its owner for what was described as an unusually generous sum, and resigned his academic position. Dr. Margaret Blackwood, a colleague who had initially collaborated with Wells on the study, documented her concerns in a letter to the university dean. "Harrison has developed an unhealthy obsession with the artwork. He speaks of it as possessing consciousness and intent, concepts that have no place in serious scientific inquiry. Most alarming is his recent tendency to refer to the painting as a doorway or threshold. When I suggested he distance himself from the object for a time, he became uncharacteristically hostile, accusing me of attempting to interfere with the process. I fear for his psychological well-being and strongly recommend intervention. Wells dropped from public view following these events. Fragmentary records suggest he established a private research facility in a remote area of Washington County, Missouri, where he continued his study of the painting under less regulated conditions. A former graduate assistant, James Morrison, who briefly worked with Wells at this facility, later reported that the doctor had developed elaborate theories about the painting's origins and nature. He believed the artwork was created using unusual pigments specifically formulated to induce altered states of consciousness, Morrison stated in an interview published in a 1957 issue of a paranormal research journal. He spoke of ancient techniques rediscovered by the artist, involving substances derived from certain fungi found only in the deepest ravines of the Ozark highlands. Most disturbing was his insistence that the painting served as a bridge between our reality and another, and that the figure depicted was not painted, but rather captured or trapped between worlds. According to Morrison, Wells had begun to experience visitations, during which he claimed to receive guidance from the figure in the painting. He had taken to sleeping in the same room as the artwork, claiming that his dreams had become educational experiences during which he was shown the path toward transition. By the time Morrison left the facility in early 1952, Wells had reportedly begun preparing for what he called the exchange, a process he believed would allow him to cross the threshold. A fire destroyed this facility in 1952, reportedly claiming Wells' life, though his body was never conclusively identified among the remains. The painting, protected in a specially constructed fireproof case, according to one account, survived. The county fire inspector's report notes several unusual aspects of the blaze. The fire appears to have originated simultaneously in multiple locations throughout the structure, suggesting deliberate setting. Most peculiar is the pattern of burn marks in the central laboratory, which radiate outward from the location where Dr. Wells reportedly kept the painting in question. The steel case containing the artwork was found intact amid the ruins, its surface unmarked by fire despite temperatures sufficient to melt glass fixtures in the immediate vicinity. The painting's final documented owner was Elizabeth Carver, a wealthy widow from Springfield who acquired it at auction in 1958. Unlike previous owners, Carver appeared to understand and embrace the painting's reputation. A journal discovered among her effects after her death reveals that she had been researching the painting for years before acquiring it, collecting accounts of its history and effects from various sources throughout the region. Carver's background offers possible insight into her unusual approach to the painting. Before her marriage to industrialist Henry Carver, she had studied anthropology at Vassar College, with a particular interest in folk beliefs and rituals. Following her husband's death in 1950, she had devoted considerable resources to investigating paranormal phenomena and what she termed threshold experiences, accounts of individuals who claimed to have briefly accessed other planes of existence. Her journal entries from 1955, 3 years before acquiring the painting, reference her growing interest in the artwork. The Ozark painting, as it is colloquially known, represents the most compelling case of a threshold object I have encountered in my research. The consistency of experiences reported by its owners, spanning over 5 decades, suggests a genuine phenomenon rather than mere folklore. Most significant is the recurring motif of the exchange, a concept mentioned by multiple owners despite no apparent communication between them. By 1957, Carver had compiled an extensive dossier on the painting, including interviews with relatives of previous owners and anyone who had encountered the artwork directly. Her journal reveals a methodical approach to understanding what she believed was its true nature. The conventional interpretation that the painting somehow induces madness is simplistic and unsatisfying. The pattern of effects suggests something far more profound, not mental deterioration, but a gradual shift in perception that allows the viewer to recognize the painting's true nature as a point of contact between Realities, Carver's journal entries, suggest she viewed the painting not as a curiosity or a subject of study, but as a potential doorway to another mode of existence. She writes of feeling drawn to its promise and being weary of this world of limitations. Unlike the frantic, deteriorating notes of previous owners, Carver's writings remain lucid and methodical throughout, documenting her growing relationship with the painting with unsettling clarity. It requires a willing participant, she writes in one entry dated March 1962. The others fought against the exchange, even as they were drawn to it. Their resistance created the madness. I will not resist. I will complete what they could not. Carver lived alone except for a part-time housekeeper who visited twice weekly. According to the housekeeper's later statement to authorities, Carver had installed the painting in her bedroom and would spend hours seated before it, though she always covered it with a velvet cloth when others were present. In her final months, Carver reportedly spoke of making preparations and seemed peaceful, almost joyful, despite her increasingly frail physical condition. The housekeeper, Martha Jenkins, recalled, "Mrs. Carver changed in the months after she got that painting, but not like you'd expect from the stories. She didn't get nervous or afraid, quite the opposite. She grew calmer, more at peace. She told me once that she'd finally found the door she'd been searching for all her life. When I asked what door she meant, she just smiled and said I wouldn't understand yet." In the final weeks before her disappearance, Carver made several unusual preparations. She updated her will, leaving her considerable estate to various educational institutions. She systematically donated or discarded most of her personal possessions, a process her attorney described as methodical divestment. Most notably, she commissioned a specialized frame for the painting, an elaborate construction of aged oak inlaid with symbols that Jenkins described as similar to eyes or doorways. Carver's final journal entry, dated September 2, 1963, reads, "The preparations are complete. The frame has been fortified to withstand the transition, and the figure has advanced to the very threshold. Tonight, when the moon is directly overhead, I will complete the exchange that so many before me attempted. Unlike them, I have no fear of what waits beyond, no attachment to this pale shadow of existence. I go willingly with full understanding of the irreversible nature of the transition. What they saw as madness, I recognize as transcendence." On September 4, 1963, the housekeeper arrived to find Carver's home empty. A thorough search of the property revealed no sign of the elderly woman, though there was no indication of forced entry or struggle. Her bed was neatly made, her clothes were arranged in her closet, and a cold cup of tea sat on the table beside her reading chair. The painting, which had hung on the wall opposite her bed for 5 years, was missing from its frame, which remained in place, empty. Jenkins's statement to the police describes the scene. Everything was in perfect order, like Mrs. Carver had just stepped out for a moment. But something felt wrong about the room. It was cold, colder than it should have been on a September morning, and there was a smell I couldn't place, like earth after heavy rain. The strangest thing was the frame. It was still hanging on the wall, but the painting was gone. Just an empty frame with no sign that the canvas had been cut or removed forcibly. Detective Howard Branson, who led the investigation into Carver's disappearance, noted in his official report, "No evidence of foul play or planned departure." The subject's purse containing identification, keys, and approximately $200 in cash was found on the bedside table. Her automobile remains in the garage. Most unusual is the missing artwork, valued at several $1,000s according to insurance records, while the ornate frame remains undisturbed. No fingerprints were found on the frame except those matching the subject and her housekeeper. No trace of either Elizabeth Carver or the canvas itself has ever been found, despite an extensive investigation. The empty frame was eventually claimed by a distant relative and donated to the Missouri State Historical Society, where it remained in storage until 1968, when a fire in the archive facility destroyed it, along with numerous other artifacts. The curator who processed the donation, Dr. Catherine Wheeler, no relation to the earlier owner, documented her impressions. The frame is unusual both in construction and ornamentation. The wood appears to be oak, aged considerably beyond what would be expected for an object made within the last decade. Most notable are the symbols carved at regular intervals around the inner edge, stylized representations that resemble eyes or perhaps keyholes. The craftsmanship is exceptional, though the overall effect is distinctly unsettling. Dr. Wheeler further noted that the inner edge of the frame showed unusual wear patterns, as though the wood had been subjected to extreme pressure or heat along the border that would have contacted the canvas. She also observed a faint but persistent odor emanating from the wood, reminiscent of ozone or electrical discharge. Occasional rumors have surfaced in the decades since, claiming that the painting has reappeared in private collections or remote galleries. A photograph purporting to show the artwork surfaced in a regional art magazine in 1972, though the image is of poor quality and the provenance unverified. The article accompanying the photograph quoted an anonymous collector who claimed to have seen the painting in a small gallery in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, describing it as a rather unremarkable landscape, distinguished only by the uncanny sense that the solitary figure it depicts seems to be looking directly at the viewer. Regardless of viewing angle, in 1986, an elderly resident of Branson, Missouri, claimed to have encountered the original painting in the home of a reclusive neighbor. According to his account, published in a local newspaper, the painting had changed significantly from earlier descriptions, now showing a farmhouse much like any other in these hills, but completely empty of human figures. When he inquired about the painting's history, his neighbor reportedly smiled and said only that the exchange was completed long ago. The door stands empty now. The neighbor, identified only as E.C. in the article, was described as an elderly woman of refined manners and unusual vitality despite her apparent advanced age. When reporters attempted to locate this individual for follow-up interviews, the address provided was found to be vacant, with local records showing no recent occupants. Perhaps the most intriguing development in the painting's story occurred in 1994, when a photograph album was discovered during renovations to the original Hendrickson property near Branson. The album, found sealed within a wall cavity, contained several images dated 1902, including one purporting to show the infamous painting. The photograph, though damaged by time and moisture, clearly depicts a landscape with a rural homestead and a stand of trees. Most notable is the apparent absence of any human figure in the scene, despite written descriptions from the period consistently mentioning this element. The contradiction led art historian Dr. James Morrison to propose an unsettling theory. What if the figure was never part of the painted scene at all? What if what witnesses perceived was something reflected in or projected onto the canvas, perhaps even a manifestation of their own psyche? This would explain the inconsistent descriptions of the figure's appearance and position across different accounts. An alternative explanation was offered by parapsychologist Dr. Eleanor Blackwood in her 1996 book Thresholds: Objects as Gateways Between Worlds. Blackwood suggests that the Ozark painting served as a permeable boundary between realities, with the figure representing an entity attempting to cross from one plane to another. The inconsistencies in witnesses' descriptions reflect the entity's gradual progress toward complete transition, a process that required a willing human participant to exchange places with it. Researchers and curiosity seekers continue to search for the painting. Drawn by its dark history and the persistent question at its core, was the Ozark painting merely a catalyst for latent psychological disturbances in those who possessed it? Or was there something genuinely uncanny in its shifting imagery and apparent influence? Without the painting itself to examine, we may never know with certainty. What can be said with confidence is that between 1902 and 1963, 7 individuals who possessed this artwork for extended periods experienced profound psychological changes. Their deterioration followed remarkably similar patterns: initial fascination giving way to obsession, increasing isolation, persistent references to the figure, the exchange, and crossing over, and ultimately a complete detachment from normal human concerns, including self-preservation. Perhaps most disturbing is the consistency with which these individuals, despite their suffering, seem to approach their ends with a sense of achievement or fulfillment, as though their madness was not a descent, but an ascension toward some profound understanding just beyond ordinary perception. In 2001, during an interview for a regional historical journal, Martha Jenkins, the former housekeeper of Elizabeth Carver, offered a final reflection on the painting's legacy. Mrs. Carver told me something once that I've never forgotten. She said, "The painting doesn't create madness. It reveals the madness of believing this world is all there is." I didn't understand what she meant then. Sometimes I think I'm beginning to. The empty frame that once held the canvas hangs now only in our collective memory, a border between known history and lingering mystery. Like the painting it once contained, the story itself shifts slightly with each telling, the details never quite aligned, the figure at its center never fully glimpsed. And perhaps that is for the best. For as Dr. Crawford wrote in his final coherent entry before his disappearance, "The danger lies not in looking at the painting, but in allowing the painting to look too deeply at you. The exchange goes both ways. The door opens from both sides. The most disturbing possibility of all may be that the painting achieved exactly what it was created to do, and that somewhere, on the other side of its frame, those who vanished may still be watching, waiting for the next observer to stand before the canvas and begin the cycle anew." To this day, the hills and hollows of the Ozarks hold many secrets. In remote cabins and forgotten attics, objects of power and mystery may still wait, doorways to places beyond ordinary perception. And if you should ever encounter an oil painting of an Ozark homestead, with a solitary figure that seems to shift position when viewed from different angles or in changing light, perhaps it would be wiser to look away, to leave it undisturbed in its dusty corner. For some doors, once opened, cannot be easily closed again, and some exchanges, once begun, must inevitably be completed.